Hi and welcome to Watercolour Wednesday with me, Rebecca Jarman. It's great to have you, thank you for joining me. In today's class I'm going to teach you how to paint this turtle swimming in the sea. We're going to use three different techniques throughout this intermediate class. We're going to use the salt resist technique to create texture in the bottom of the ocean, and we're also going to use some masking fluid around the head of the turtle and also some cling film too to create some texture and light reflections in the sea. So also in this video below in the description box you'll find the downloadable PDF. Click on the link, download, trace it onto your watercolour paper and let's get started. So to begin with, trace your turtle onto the watercolour paper. You'll find the image below in the description box. Click the link and download and print at home. Then get a masking fluid brush. You want a small brush for this. Gently agitate the masking fluid in the bottle and then apply the masking fluid on the lines around the head of the turtle. This is going to preserve those lines for us and make it easier to paint around those shapes. So once you've placed your masking fluid down, you don't want to sort of scrub at it with the brush, just let it dry. There's a little bit around his nose as well. And then once you've applied it, make sure you firmly secure the lid back on the bottle so it doesn't go off. Now mixing the green for the variegated wash in the background, you want to use cadmium yellow and cerulean blue. You can also see in my palette I have an area of cerulean blue on its own, also an area of ultramarine blue, and we'll be using all three colours to create the variegated wash of the sea. So that's my pale green mix with the cerulean blue and the cadmium yellow. And to begin with, we're going to do a wet in wet technique using the cling film resist. So take off a length of cling film that's going to cover that top section of your painting, and take a large brush and wet the background. Don't go onto the turtle, go carefully up to the edges of the turtle with the water, and you just want to wet the sea section, so that's the top half of the background. You don't want any water in that bottom section. So once you've applied the water, go in first of all with your cerulean blue paint. Use a nice large brush, and you need to work fairly quickly so that the water that you've first applied doesn't dry. So I'm using a number 12 brush here with my cerulean blue. So popping it here and there in that sea area, and I'm leaving some white areas too, and this time I'm going into those white areas with the pale green mix. So take a little bit of care when you're painting around the turtle. Just come up to the edges of him, and you want the blue and the green to start to merge on the surface of the paper. So that's why we wet the paper first. The two will blend together nicely. Just take care around those edges. And like I say, work reasonably quickly. Be positive with your strokes, don't be tentative. Speed is of the essence here because obviously you want to get that cling film on before this paint begins to dry. So I'm just finishing off around the edges of the turtle, and now I'm going to apply the ultramarine blue at the bottom, just up to the edge of where the bottom of the sea meets that horizon line there in the distance. So that's why I'm painting this a little bit darker with the ultramarine blue, to show some sort of spatial element, sort of distance there. So bringing that paint down to the line that we traced from the reference image. And you can see those three colours are sort of merging nicely on the surface of the paper. And just tidy up any little edges. If you've left any, you don't want any white spots in that wash. And then you can take your cling film and lay it down on the surface and press it into the wet paint. So again, you don't want to be tentative about this. You really do need to press that cling film into the surface of the wet paint quite firmly, and you have a little bit of time to manipulate it so that you get some crinkles and wrinkles, and these are what's going to create those shapes for you. So a little bit of manoeuvring with that cling film to get it stuck down to the surface. And then what's really important with this is that you allow it to dry completely before you remove it, and it must dry naturally. Don't try taking a hairdryer to it because it'll lift up the cling film and it'll spoil the technique. You won't get any shapes then at all. So be patient and allow it to completely dry naturally. Just a really quick pause, folks. If you're enjoying this video, please give me a like. Click that like button and give me a thumbs up. And also, if you click subscribe and also the bell icon as well, you'll receive a notification every week when I upload a new watercolour video. Now let's get back to the class. So to remove it, you just want to peel up a corner first and check that it's dry. If there's no wet paint, then you can remove it carefully from the surface, peel it away, and you should be left with quite distinct shapes. So you can see there's some beautiful organic kind of, well, actually geometric shapes really, showing the light hitting the water. Now I'm just taking a damp brush, it's clean, and I'm touching up some little areas. So when I was pressing the cling film into the turtle, some of the paint splayed onto the turtle itself. So just take a clean damp brush and rub away at that section on the edge, and then press a piece of kitchen paper towel, press it down into that water that you've just used, and it'll remove any paint that you don't want there. And because we've used quite light paint washes, it should lift up quite easily for you. So we haven't used any staining pigments at all, so these should lift quite nicely. So just go around all of those edges and rub away anything that you don't want. Obviously we've worked very quickly in the background because you don't want the paint to dry, so you're sort of working fast, and sometimes you can sort of, these edges get a little bit messy. So this is a really quick and easy way to rectify that. So a little bit of paint went on his flippers there as well. Those are the two back flippers you can see at the bottom of the turtle. And just going around his head finally to reveal the shape and the crisp outline. Okay, so now I'm going to mix a colour for the body of the turtle, and we're using that pale green mix that we already created for the sea. We're just going to add some more cadmium yellow to it to create a very light green colour, and this is going to form the basis of our turtle. So I'm going in with a little bit more of that cadmium yellow into the light green mix to lighten it up further and to create a colour that resembles the sort of the overall colour of the turtle, if you like, the underbelly of the turtle. So you can see the original green there on the tester strip, and now you can see the light green that I've just mixed. And if I bring it up to the reference image, you can see that it's very, very similar to what I wanted. So that's the cerulean blue and cadmium yellow to create that colour. So I'm going to take my number 12 brush, just have damp bristles, and I'm going to apply that green wash colour onto dry paper. So you want to use a slightly big brush for this. If you use a small brush, it'll take you too long to fill out the space and the shape, and you'll end up with some hard lines. So if you use a nice big brush with a point, so that you can get into the detail, you can get into the edges without making any errors. But if you use a larger brush and apply plenty of paint to the bristles, then you should be able to cover this shape reasonably quickly without having any hard lines. So if you go from left to right in a sort of sweeping motion, keep applying more paint and move quite quickly, and you'll find that you'll have a nice even flat wash across the entire shape. Don't forget his little flippers there. And keep going until you've covered him, and then you must allow that to completely dry. And once the paint's dry, we can mix up the two colours we want for our variegated wash on the seabed. So I'm just going into that light green mix that I'd used, and I'm adding the cadmium red. I want to create something that resembles like a yellow ochre kind of colour, so I've added some more yellow to that mix as well. And now I'm using the ultramarine blue, adding cadmium red and cadmium yellow to create a sort of a dark brown colour, a bit like burnt sienna, I suppose. So this creates a little bit of a grey kind of colour to begin with, and I'm not happy with that. So as you can see on the tester, it's sort of quite grey, so I'm warming it up with some more cadmium red and then a little cadmium yellow, so it's nice and warm, and we go back to that sort of brown colour. And the first colour I'm using there resembles a yellow ochre. So if you have yellow ochre and burnt sienna, you can actually use those colours straight from your palette rather than mixing them. So I'm taking my really large number 18 brush, and I'm going to wet the area of the seabed first. So by using a nice big brush, you can cover the area very quickly. So it's really quite hot at the moment, so just make sure you cover every aspect of that shape. If you tilt the board, you'll find that you can see if you've missed any areas. And then use a round large brush, I think I'm using a number 12, just to apply that brown colour. And again, just go across the area, leaving patches of brown here and there. You know, there's nothing scientific about this. I'm just kind of being as random as I can, placing down patches of brown colour until I'm happy that I've got enough on that area. And the idea is to create a sort of a soft mix of the light and the dark, and they'll spread together on the surface because it's wet. So we've got that, obviously, that lovely fuzzy wet in wet technique. And then once we're happy, we will apply the table salt. So once I've got enough brown on, I can switch colours, and I can start adding some of that yellow ochre that I've mixed in the palette. So this creates a sort of the idea is a sort of a sandy seabed, really. And it's only emulating it. There's no detail in this whatsoever. We're just allowing the paint to do what it wants to do, to blend together on the surface. And then we're going to be sprinkling the salt down, and again allowing that to do what it wants to do and create the texture for us. So this part of the painting, this aspect of the painting, is really quite freeing. You don't want to be too tense about this at all. Just go with the flow and see what the paint does. So now I'm taking a little amount of paint in my hand and then using the finger and thumb to pinch a little bit up, and then I'm sprinkling it at a small height above the paper and letting it drop to the surface. But what I'm not doing is I'm not applying it in great blobs of salt, so there's not great big clumps of salt across the surface. There's quite an even coverage, so each granule, if you like, of salt has got a space around it. So it's evenly distributed over the surface, and then you have to allow it to dry completely before moving on. So now it's dry, you can see that it's created this lovely texture for me. And I'm going to use the dark brown paint that I mixed before. So if you haven't mixed it, you can use your burnt sienna. And I'm just taking my number 12 brush and applying it to the head of the turtle, being careful not to paint across his eye. But you can see you can paint completely across those lines of masking fluid without having to worry about them at all. So this was the whole point of applying the masking fluid in the first place. We can create these sharp shapes without actually painting them in. So we can paint our layers on top and then remove the masking fluid at the end to reveal those shapes. So this is my mix of burnt sienna. And now I'm just looking at the reference image and I'm using the tip of my brush to put down little strokes of paint across the back of the neck and sort of across the top of the shell there. I'm not applying too much pressure, and this is on this is on dry paper as well, remember. So wherever I place the paint, it's going to stay there. So it's going to create some sort of hard edges. And again, giving us a little bit of texture. So I'm just using it under his chin here and using the reference image really to see where the darks and the lights are. So you need to use your observational skills. And then I'm going to do the same thing really across the belly and underside of this turtle. Vary the strength of the colour just by adding a little bit more water. You know, you can make it lighter that way. And just using the tip of my brush to make these little marks. So observe the lines. The lines are sort of horizontal across his flipper there. You don't really have any vertical marks. But if you put pressure down on your brush, you're going to make this fat mark. So you want to be just applying a very small amount of pressure to create that nice fine line detail. So you can see just the very tip of my brush in some areas, and in others, if I want a fatter mark, I'm using slightly on the side of the brush and pressing down a bit further. And there's also some dark marks on his flippers at the back. So his left hand flipper, it's entirely, you can't see it, it's hidden by his body. So if you thought that little one at the bottom was his left flipper, it's not, it's actually one of his back flippers. So that can be a little bit confusing sometimes. But I'm just building up these marks now across the turtle. And I'm going to take a smaller brush this time. So this is a number 6 brush with the same paint on it. And I'm going to use the side of my little finger to rest on the surface of the paper. Because when you're painting details, and you really need to anchor your hand, and that way you won't put too much pressure down on the lines. And now you want to be using broken lines when it comes to the bottom, the belly of the turtle. So rather than a long line, you want to break that line up. It looks a lot more natural that way. So little tiny lines that kind of crisscross around his belly. Again, use your observational skills and take your time there. Again, I'm working on the dry paper, so these marks will stay nice and crisp. And I'm just mixing up a bit more of my dark brown here using the ultramarine blue, cadmium red and cadmium yellow. Obviously the darker I want it, the more blue I add to create that darker brown. So it's a thicker consistency. So that's the original brown I was using, and there in the corner is the darker brown I've just mixed. It's a little thicker in consistency, therefore it's going to be a darker paint. And I'm just using that to paint his eye. And then while I've got that dark paint on my brush, I can start adding further details to his head. So just observing where those darks are and using the very tip of my brush to create these small suggestive brush strokes. So this is why it's an intermediate class this week, folks. You are needing to use your observational skills, and obviously we're using several different techniques as well. So if you're a complete beginner and you're finding this difficult, try some of my beginner classes. The Back to Basics series is ideal for you. And I'll pop a link below this video so you can have a look at those. But I'm just adding further details with the tip of my brush, looking at where those darks are and placing them down. Now, while the paint's wet, it's usually up to 30% darker than when it dries. So you need to bear that in mind as well when you're mixing up your colours. So I'm continuing to add more darker details across the tortoise. Sorry, turtle, my goodness. So defining this edge of his flipper, actually, this is quite important. We want to get that curved shape. So first of all, I've gone down and I've placed a dark line, and now I'm adding a little bit of water on my small brush and I'm blending it out a little bit. And it's going to create a little shadow as it comes around. And looking at the belly of the turtle now, we need to go darker. It's far too light at the moment. So I'm going to glaze with a slightly light brown colour and just glazing that over the top of that sort of original green. And we've got a nice depth of colour there. So it's much more like the reference image now, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing in different places across that turtle's flipper, working inside the shapes. So now the masking fluid is dry and we've completed the head, we can actually start to remove it with the pad of our finger. It just sort of balls up. If you rub against it in one direction, the masking fluid will ball up together and come off. You can pick it off. You must make sure that the surrounding paint is dry when you do this, otherwise you'll smudge it and make a little bit of a mess. So now I've done that, obviously the lines are white, they're the white of the original paper. So we need to blend this in a little bit. So I'm going to use the pale brown paint to paint over the white lines just to dull them down, to blend it into the painting a little bit. Obviously they're just too white at the moment and it just does not look natural at all. So a little bit of that pale brown paint, the same as we used for the body, the belly of the turtle. And you can see that this really nicely blends into the rest of the head. But unfortunately, as it dries lighter. So I do have to go back and add a layer or two more of this light colour. So I'm just blending in those edges with a bit of water as well so that they're not so harsh. So again, a bit more paint on these lines because they've dried and they're still fairly pale, so not quite dark enough. I want to get to a colour that's very similar to his belly. And now I want to actually lift some light out of his head because the light of this sun is hitting the top of his head and there's a nice light patch around his eye. So I'm just using the tip of a damp brush to rub at the surface and then use the paper towel to lift that paint away, and it reveals a lovely light area. So just dabbing it away with the kitchen paper, and that's looking much better now. But by dabbing that, it's actually removed some of the paint on the light lines. So I need to go back in with some more paint on those lighter lines in a minute. I'm just lightening up the edge of his mouth there. The top of his jaw has a lighter line to it where the light is hitting it. And I'm going to remove a bit on the back of his shell, because again, that's where the light is casting down. Adding some paint back into those light lines now that I'd lifted out with a paper towel by accident, and getting that sort of similar colour to the body, to the belly. So that's the turtle done, and I'm just going to remove the masking tape. Just take care when you do this and pull it away from your painting at an angle. And that way, if you do happen to tear your paper, it tears away from your painting and not into your painting, you see, so you can get a nice crisp edge by doing that. So tearing away from your painting. So I hope you've enjoyed painting this with me today. Join me again next week for another Watercolour Wednesday, where I'll have another full-length painting video for you. Take care, I'll see you soon.